Hello, thank you. Josh's voice is mostly back, so he might join me for Q&A. Yeah, I'm going to try not to go too fast, but I also want to make sure there's time for questions, so I apologize if at any point I'm speaking too quickly. This is a paper about representation and diversity in games, but it's also a paper about how we study and talk about representation in games. We began this project by seeking to move beyond anecdotal accounts of the limited representative and performative possibilities afforded players in games, to develop a census of playable characters that could begin to allow us to quantify the formal demographic possibilities within the medium of games. Representation is only one factor for considering how games affect players, but as Adrian Shaw put it, representation is important because it's an external acknowledgement of one's existence. And people want to see themselves in media because they want people like them to be seen. Our results provide a sample of a landscape within which discussions of representation, identification, affect, individual experience, and even systematic marginalization of certain representations and identities can occur. Our paper makes two contributions. The first is an exploratory but extensive empirical census of game player characters that confirms account of homogeneous representation in games. The second is a methodological contribution that invites the community to reconsider representation as an interpretive phenomenon, one that requires a multiplicity of perspectives in order to understand more fully. We observed only player characters in our census, that is, the characters that players inhabit in-game or from whose perspective or position players are shown the game world. Focusing on player characters highlights the transaction of players receiving, choosing, or creating their characters, and allows for questions about some of the trade-offs that players make or tolerate in these processes, and the way that players' subject position and the subject position of their characters or their avatar interact, align, or diverge. I will quickly note that in the interest of time, I will mostly be speaking to games with single default characters in this presentation. There are several related important efforts that complement our study, some of which were presented at this very conference in the last couple of days. I'll quickly go over, unfortunately, just two. William et al.'s The Virtual Census describes a collection of 133 unique games and the top 150 games sold, released during 2005. They included all the characters in the first 30 minutes and compared them to the US Census in their analysis. Shaw and Friesen described difficulties with large-scale surveys concerned with representation in games content, using examples from the LGBTQ video game archive that is working to archive all queer characters in all video games, and they're doing a really great job. An observation of theirs, relevant to ours, is how coding characters relies on previous knowledge or related media in games. They also argue for a proper historicization and empirical grounding to discussions of representation, which we echo. We observed a semi-random convenient sample of 200 games from the Transformative Play Lab at UCI's 1,500 plus game library. I believe it's over 2,000 now, using a die in our inclusion criteria. While we consider the study exploratory, it is worth mentioning that it might actually be the largest of its kind. We played each game for about 30 minutes, recording development tier, characters' apparent species, race, gender, or a range of possibilities, and more that we hope to describe in future work. AAA and indie are categories colloquially used within games culture to distinguish games across aesthetic and stylistic lines, as well as budgetary scales, and can be complicated to disengage. Here, we use a limited differentiation based on the size of the company and the budget behind the development of the game, and code its tier accordingly. There is a common narrative within games culture that risk-averse publishers will not invest in titles not likely to sell well. This logic, coupled with assumptions about audiences, is frequently used to justify a perceived lack of diversity in mainstream games. Similarly, indie games are often viewed as more experimental, which can translate to more diverse characters. Distinguishing between AAA and indie games in data like ours allows us to interrogate how these claims play out in our data. To avoid excessively imposing our own preferences when selecting our sample, we rolled a die to progress down the list of games in our library, but we couldn't accept every game we landed on. Games needed to include some form of embodied narrative and be set in a world at least inhabited by humanoids. Sticks, on the left, where the players control a lone goblin in a world entirely populated by settler colonial white guys, invites great conversations about representation despite the inhuman protagonist was included. Tetris, on the right, is an example of a game we could not include because we aren't sure we have the tools to have a conversation about representation in games like it, though I like to joke it only has one straight character, so maybe there's a way. Character codes were emergent based on the characters that we observed and iterated as new codes were defined and new demographic categories became apparent. Not all characters in our sample were baseline human. We built a list of potential species codes as examples were encountered and chose from that list upon finding repeat examples. We also coded for race, and like with species, we built a list of potential races as encountered and chose from that list upon finding repeat examples. I put these on the same slide, but purposely distinguished between them because their relationship is complicated, especially in games. Race can be difficult to discuss and quantify. There's hardly enough time in this presentation to give a complete genealogy, but it would be irresponsible to use the term without at least quickly acknowledging the very real histories and institutions of authority and conflict built upon the concept of race. We reference in the paper some of the ways that race has been wielded to exert power over others, including through the use of censuses and census-like studies specifically. Species is clearly understood to be biologically coded. Race only meant this historically, but has a habit of still being perceived as biological. Academically, and commonly, race is now generally considered discursive. In games, race is rarely, if ever, used to describe the groups that it marks in the real world. Instead, race almost always refers to biological speciation within fantasy and sci-fi contexts, marking elves, dwarves, goblins, humans. While in other categories, we tried to reflect the explicit content of the game. With these, we chose to follow the common use in academic lead and acknowledge the importance, histories, and accepted meanings of race. Or, as Tanner Higgin, concerned with the erasure of black bodies in online games, puts it, race is just as much a discursive construct as a coded one. Theories that rely solely on the interpretable logics of games and technical design cannot adequately account for how players deal with issues of race on an everyday basis. Higgin is skeptical of statistical data on blackness or race and asks rhetorically, what shade of skin truly is black after all? I will return to this question, but answering it is immensely difficult and informed by the cultural layer within which the character and the player reside. We began with feminine, masculine, and undeterminable to code the apparent gender of characters, intending to add as observed, but other than undeterminable, we did not find any default player characters that deviated enough from typical biologically deterministic expectations to create other codes, which is a finding unto itself. This is just an example of what the codes might look like for a handful of games. When we either struggled to read a character or disagreed on reads, we consulted an ad hoc collection of colleagues within our lab and department for input and impressions. We didn't require them to play the game or reproduce our method. We simply showed them an image and discussed impressions and requested feedback. We were attempting to validate our coding process. However, as research progressed, it became evident that readers often brought different perspectives to each character. I will return to this subject after describing our quantitative findings. These findings directly illustrate some of the racial and gendered inequalities present in the representational landscape of playable characters in games. This part is straightforward descriptive statistics, so I'll also move through it fairly quickly without going into each individual category. But if you have any questions, please come back to me later. While we do not attempt to define what adequate representation looks like, our data at the intersection of race and gender demographic identifiers for single default characters describes a clear skew towards whiteness and masculinity across all development tiers. Surprising, perhaps, is that the second largest demographic combination is characters of undeterminable race and gender, despite no AAA examples. By undeterminable, we mean literally we couldn't figure them out. This is often because despite an embodied narrative and a player character of some kind, their body is either obscured and or otherwise difficult to discern by chance or design. Effectively, we don't know either, but often we aren't meant to. It can be argued that these characters are designed to be self-interpretive vessels for players to project themselves onto, but it seems unlikely this is always the case. It is also worth noting that, if you haven't noticed already, green inhuman males have equal total representation in our sample than Asian and black human males, and greater representation than any discernible feminine demographic of color, regardless of development tier. Looking at less represented but discernible demographic categories, we see no significant difference between AAA and indie games in our sample. So our dataset represents a small step towards understanding representation within the medium, but characters we coded undeterminable for race and gender held our analytic attention. While these characters may provide players with greater opportunity for interpretation and the reimagination of characters in defiance of gender or racial norms, they aren't necessarily more diverse in the sense of representation. When the default interpretation of characters within a given media landscape skews heavily towards certain norms, imagining characters in a less normative way, such as queer, feminine, non-white, requires effort on the part of players, especially when the narratives that accompany undeterminable characters still reproduce dominant tropes that widely pervade games and culture. These characters exist within a normative context that exerts power and renders certain interpretations more likely than others, and embody much of what makes representation something difficult to simply count. Partly because of the discussions we had surrounding difficult-to-code characters, we realized inter-rater variability rather than inter-rater reliability was valuable in this context. Disregarding variable or minority readings would also mean disregarding the cultural and personal context that produced them. In Gaming at the Edge, Adrian Shaw argues that while the presence of aesthetic representation can matter, without sensitive and responsible narrative support, even diverse bodies cannot actually encompass the experience of inhabiting the world with a specific identity. In Shaw's case, hours spent speaking to and playing alongside diverse players led her to reconsider her orientation that representation simply does matter, to describing how it depends not only on the character presentation, but on how players identify in relation to that character. In our case, it was the time spent with the vast collection of characters and the input and feedback of a diverse group of colleagues that required us to reevaluate our data and overturn our assumptions. We are not attempting to undermine inter-rater reliability or as an appropriate methodology more broadly. We only claim that in certain situations, such as dealing with reading representational possibility, it may not be the best strategy. As Higgins said, we have a hard enough time regarding what shade of skin is truly like black TM. Consensus readings among a demographically uniform or less diverse group of researchers, risks excluding absent subjectivities in the virtual erasure of actual marginalized people in media. To be even clearer, we aren't saying representation is purely subjective and that any character might be anything demographically. After only bringing difficult characters to people for feedback, we brought some easy ones to kind of sanity checks. The guy on the left here, who we discussed in the paper in more detail, was read entirely masculine by everyone we asked. Most of the people asked also thought he was white, although we did have one who thought he might be Latinx. The body on the right had a range of judgments, which for brevity I'll just say that this character is complicated. And we read them as undeterminable across the board. But others who hadn't played the game read this character's gender as either masculine or neutral. None suggested undeterminable or feminine, which is interesting as the only voice heard coming from this body is feminine. And while most read this character's race as undeterminable, there were several people who assumed they were white. Many characters have consistently read demographic positions that tend towards consensus even when read by many. But acknowledging that characters, like people, don't always fit cleanly into boxes makes it invaluable to observe the range of possible positions less demographically certain characters may represent to players. Of course, it takes more than different cultural or physiological identities or positions to introduce varied judgments. Tastes, interests, general knowledge, and previous experience play a role. We often brought our own intertextual and paratextual knowledge to the readings of these characters, but rather than disregard our prior knowledge, we accepted it as part of our personal background, as inherent in our judgments as the impressions of skin tone. The disagreements that arose surrounding various characters and the variety of demographic identifiers that we might assign them force us to reevaluate our method and reconsider familiar forms of authoritative statistics about characters that cannot speak for themselves. We are actually discussing bodies here, or performative possibilities, not identities. We cannot expressly address the identities of either the characters or the players in a study like this, only the possibility space within which identity work can occur. As we transform our research, rather than coding characters according to a single or small consensus read, and representing them as a tick mark in a box, we're developing a tool for collaborative probabilistic reads. As an example, instead of reading arid, pictured at the top, as undeterminable across the board as we did, we begin to display characters with a percentage of how they are read by anyone who's willing to contribute. And finally, any attempt at capturing the prismatic reality that is the complex, contingent, and constructed demographic identities important to discussing representation must refrain from foreclosing on them. In this paper, we provided our readings of a corpus of playable characters that illustrates a certain perspective on the landscape of representation in these games. More importantly, this this collection of interpretations and the methodological shift toward integrator variability as data itself that we suggest in this context should help us not only with our own research, but as we continue to develop it, but other scholars interested in related work. Thank you.
Josh Miller from Northeastern University.
Hello.
Very interesting talk. I appreciate that it was both exploratory and extensive.
Yeah, that's amazing how that worked.
I'm interested in how you identified that you have indie and AAA in your analysis. I'm wondering whether you included or explicitly excluded AA or AB games, and could you speak to that design choice?
Can you define what you mean by AA and AB for me before I answer that question?
I just mean that there are other terms that some people give more nuanced definitions to the production level of games, and were you, for every game, either categorizing it as AAA or indie for the sake of separating these into categories, or did you use some other metric to define these as AAA or indie?
I kind of alluded this a little bit in the presentation, how we simplified it in terms of just budgetary constraints. We did have a number of games in the collection that when we first went through were kind of left that code blank because we're like, something in the middle.
Yeah.
I think I actually put in the spreadsheet originally like something in the middle ellipses because I wasn't sure, and we had to really kind of talk about that. Part of it was that we didn't have very many that ended up occupying that category, first of all. Second of all, when we tried to kind of find some of these other definitions, there are so many that attempt to define this nuanced one, but that don't necessarily agree with each other. We ended up kind of making a judgment call for the interest of the data and saying, okay, well, let's look at this like handful and say, where do they kind of lean towards it? In the paper, we actually described instead of a binary of AAA and indie, it's really a spectrum, and most games don't really cleanly fall on one and the other. They almost all fall somewhere on that, and so for us, it was more like, okay, there's a bunch that are pretty clearly towards the end, but this one maybe falls on that half, so we'll call it indie for this case. But I absolutely agree that in an absolute complete census, you would have to even kind of differentiate, because there are a lot of indie games developers that become successful and then have tons of money, and then even though they're still small, they whatever, or people who leave AAA to start smaller studios but bring their clout and money with them.
Yeah, I'm wondering now if it might even be possible to sort of quantify it by like size of the team working on it or budget or something like that. But it seems like the work that you were doing is more categorical, and so it would make more sense to separate it into categories to measure percentages and the like. So thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for the question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question that's more tangential to your research, but maybe you're still able to answer that. To your knowledge, is there any research about what effect non-representation in video games has on the likelihood of a player picking up a game, and if a player picks up a game, on the quality of the experience of the game? Because it seems tangential, but it seems relevant to kind of laying out that landscape.
Right. So, if you had gone to Kale's presentation 2 days ago, he actually spoke a little bit to that.
Sorry.
That's okay. So I would talk to him because he might be able to answer that question a little bit better. But also, I can summarize at least a piece of it, which is that there is some, but unfortunately, a lot of it is that people who aren't represented are so used to it that it ends up being like, oh, well, it's fine. But that's not necessarily a reason to just continue feeling it's fine from a development standpoint, is what I would say, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I will follow up.
Yes.
Thank you.
And no worries.
Max Berg from the University of Saskatchewan. Great talk, thank you very much. I was wondering if you evaluated your own language bias. So I assume that most of those games were actually in the English language. So if you, for example, looked into the Japanese market, which is predominantly, I would assume, a lot of Asian characters in there, or if you looked into the South American market where you might find more Latinx characters.
I don't think that we clearly acknowledge our language bias, straight up. There were some imports, and some translations, so we definitely had some Japanese games. I mean, I can tell you right now, there's a couple Japanese dating sims in there, Hatoful Boyfriends in there, for those of you familiar with it. It's in the census.
Cats, all those things, yeah.
Yeah, pigeons, dating pigeons, yeah. So, Yeah, no, there is like some variety because again, I mean, we have like 2,000 games. The games get donated from developers themselves, publishers, but also just from. We have a couple people that like have a problem and just buy everything that's on sale, and then they family share with us, and so our inventory does come from a lot of different places, and so there are some. Probably again, this is exploratory, so. Definitely not enough to make any real complete things, but and we probably could have acknowledged that a little bit better.
Absolutely, it's super interesting, but I think that there's also this bias. We are not really looking into those markets, and it paints a slightly darker picture.
There's slightly more Japanese games than others, just because Japanese games were more successful than South American games and such. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So I'm sorry we're out of time, but we can come talk to speakers.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to miss the coffee break, so that's.
Yeah. Anyway.